What do you do when a young, YouTube famous MMA fighter decides the fastest route to viral fame is to humiliate an old man? And that old man doesn't even flinch. Welcome back to Tales of Wonder. If you enjoy stories that hit like a left hook, where swagger meets consequence, and the quietest people teach the loudest lessons, subscribe and ring the bell for more. Now, let's begin today's story. There are two kinds of noise in the fight world. One is loud, the ring announcer with his practiced roar, the back and forth between a coach and a fighter in a cramped corner, the clack of a camera stabilizer, and the bright, hungry commentary of the internet. The other kind of noise is quiet. The scrape of a GI on a wooden floor, the small breath someone takes before a big move, the steady ticking of expectations in a room built on habit rather than hype. Our story begins in the middle of both. In the video age, fame arrives like a fastball, smashing through glass and leaving shards everywhere. Jonah Flash Mercer had that fastball, 24 broad-shouldered, and blessed by an algorithm that loved precision kicks and dramatic slow-motion edits. He had become the sort of name that turned heads at parties and made hometown coaches whisper numbers to each other. He trained in modern gyms, clean lines, LED lights, playlists designed to make fists feel triumphant. His social channels were a reel of broken boards, dramatic clinches, and challenge videos where he promised to school old-timers for sport. He was, in equal parts, hungry, generous, and wildly impatient. Across town, just far enough to be an aesthetic contrast, close enough to be a moral indictment, sat a narrow dojo with a paper sign flapping at the entrance. Though it smelled like years of sweat and tea, the mats had been patched so often they looked like a quilt. The man who ran that space, Master Kenji Saito, was the kind of person whose biography read like a low-key legend. He wasn't famous in the way Jonah was, but every fighter who mattered had, at some point, either bowed in his doorway or had a story about meeting him at crossroads. He had trained fighters, yes, but he had also stopped fights a referee could not, taught discipline to kids who had nowhere else to put it, and in the quiet hours, read anatomy books like novels. The contrast was delicious for the internet. Jonah's manager, a pragmatic optimist who understood that controversy was content, arranged a meet and greet. Easy, the manager said. A little show. We film. Viral. A lot of people said easy that week, only to later change their minds. What no one predicted, and what no camera could capture until later, was the particular geometry of ego and memory that would unfold when these two worlds collided. Jonah wanted a highlight. Kenji wanted a conversation. Jonah wanted spectacle. Kenji wanted to remind someone about the nature of cause and consequence. The scene was set on a humid Saturday afternoon. The small dojo filled with a handful of locals and a motley crew of fans, some expecting a novelty, others expecting a teachable moment they wouldn't get anywhere else. Jonah walked in with trademark swagger, scuffed sneakers, a hoodie cut to show off too much, and a smile that suggested he had already won. He posed for the phone cameras, tossed a loose line about showing the old man how MMA is done, and everyone laughed uneasy and delighted. Kenji did not pose. He sat on a bench and rubbed his hands together like a man inspecting a pair of old gloves. He was 70 or thereabouts. The face you might describe as weathered if you wanted to romanticize it, and scarred and patient if you wanted to be more honest. He had practiced restraint for decades. His moves were stored like a language he hadn't needed to speak in years. The rumor that Jonah wanted to make a fool of him had traveled ahead like smoke. Some people in the dojo wanted the spectacle. Others wanted to see what a man who had nothing left to prove would do when provoked. Jonah did not speak much. Spectacle is better when it's shown. He warmed up with the same choreography he used online, a flashy footwork sequence, a couple of spinning heel kicks caught at the precise angle that made them appear to defy gravity, a bravado-laced taunt. The people filming shouted approval. Jonah's hands were like small fists of confidence, wrapped neatly in white. He stepped into the center of the mat and, for the camera, bowed to Kenji in a performative way that said, "I acknowledge you as an accessory to my narrative." Kenji nodded once. No showdown music. No shout. The old cameras, the new cameras, and the quiet ones in the dojo took it in. If this were a movie, the script would have fans chanting an inevitable training montage. In a short film version, something symmetrical would happen. The young fighter would throw a fast punch, the old man would block with an impossible ancient hand, and the crowd would roar. But life, certainly the version of life that matters in small rooms, tends toward the imperfect, the ironic. Kenji did not move. It was the first turn in a spiral that would reveal what people really meant by strength. When you tell a young, confident fighter that someone will not move, the human response is predictable. Someone in the room will believe it's an invitation. Jonah believed that, and he believed the world was a chessboard where he had already seen the best moves. He began with small things, the kind of demonstrations that worked on a feed, a feint that made the phone holder gasp, a snap of the wrist that framed the old man as fragile. When nothing happened, no parry, no sidestep, his smile shifted to a puzzled grin, then to something hotter, impatience. The crowd pressed closer, as if proximity could force action. A teenage kid filmed the scene on his phone at a high enough resolution to capture future replays. Someone in the back muttered for a show. Jonah obliged. He raised his hands higher and sped up his legwork. He danced with a cruelty that only the young possess, a refusal to consider the long-term effects of immediate spectacle. The first escalation was theatrical, a spinning back kick aimed to land within inches of the master's ribs, a flourish finishing with a wink. It swept through the room like a warm breeze that might knock down a child but would do nothing to the man it targeted. Kenji's expression remained unchanged. He did not step, crouch, or even tighten his brow. Jonah's foot sliced the air and found nothing but the space the universe already offered. Then Jonah pushed the escalation another way. Instead of measured aggression, he tried to humiliate. He clinched, using his athleticism to push Kenji's balance, expecting the old man to fall back theatrically. The crowd, half in anticipation of spectacle and half in discomfort, inhaled in a single social breath. Jonah exerted force, a wrestler's lean, a dangerous overcommitment. He wanted to topple a shrine. Kenji did not become the statue that Jonah expected to collapse. He did not crumble or do a trick. He simply adjusted his center of gravity infinitesimally, as if correcting the tilt of a small boat in a storm. That tiny correction was like a teacher tapping a child on the shoulder and saying, "Not yet." Jonah felt it, but misread it as resistance. His ego does not easily read nuance. Now the escalation turned mean. Jonah grabbed, jerked, and attempted a throw he had practiced to show how old men can't handle modern grappling. The throw required the old man to flail or appear old. Instead, Kenji absorbed the motion like a tree flexing in the wind, almost imperceptible, very effective. Jonah's shoulder rolled. The whole of his upper body moved into that same familiar, awful rhythm fighters know, the strain of a move that will not yield. Then something physical happened the cameras couldn't anticipate. Jonah misstopped. Maybe a matte patch caught his toe. Maybe his ego made him throw his weight a fraction too far. Whatever the immediate cause, the result was inevitable, and in its own small way, merciless. His knee collapsed. It was a clean, sharp betrayal of winning mechanics, an audible, intimate sound of a body giving way that sent a ripple of adult silence through the room. Time, which had been humming fast in Jonah's head, hiccuped. The crowd went from spectator to witness in the same breath. The injury was not cinematic. It was not a heroic injury that a trainer could tape up in a montage and call character building. It was a real-life rupture, the soft, unpleasant orchestra of ligaments tearing, the electrical shock of pain that takes the breath right out of a person. Jonah yelped, a word that sounded obscene in the dojo, and fell to the mat. For a second, the only sound was the camera continuing to record, greedy and blind to nuance. Then a dozen people moved. Someone called for ice. Jonah's manager cursed, a private sound that tasted of ruined plans and insurance claims. People who had been filming for the internet suddenly wanted to do something analog, to help. Kenji did not rush. He rose with an economy of motion that suggested he had life's calendar spread in his hands and knew which days were for haste and which for patience. He did not clap a hand on Jonah's shoulder in triumph or admonition. He simply walked to the fighter and crouched with the attentiveness of someone placing a small animal back in its nest. The physical escalation had become a moral one. The young fighter's career could have snapped with that microphone-hungry moment. The old man's choice would determine whether it became a tragedy or a lesson. Someone asked, voice shaking, why Kenji hadn't moved, why he had let the boy see his risk like a child grabs a hot stove. The question was not accusatory so much as baffled. When you have the skill to stop harm, why stand still? Kenji did not answer immediately. Instead, he wrapped Jonah's knee with practiced hands that smelled faintly of tea and liniment. His touch was clinical and intimate, the hands of someone who had done more than teach. He had held people while they changed. He arranged Jonah's leg the way a piano tuner adjusts strings, careful, exact, and patient. As an onlooker, you could feel the reconfiguration of the room's moral gravity. Jonah groaned, the color in his face traveling from flushed disrespect to a pale, embarrassed helplessness. The cameras kept recording, the footage already spinning toward two different futures. One where Jonah's hubris ended someone's career, and another where, somehow, this became a parable. If the tension had been about dominance, it now bent toward responsibility. Jonah had wanted to show the old man a lesson. He had not expected to be the one learning it. As Jonah lay, labored breaths short and furious, Kenji took a step back and looked at the boy the way you look at a mirror after a long, strange day, with knowledge, compassion, and a surprising flicker of recognition. It began with a scar. Jonah had one on the outside of his left knee, small and pale, and the color of paper once handled by a nervous hand. As people around him unrolled ice packs and phone screens, Kenji's eyes traced the line of it like a librarian finding a familiar book. It was not the kind of detail you notice if you only skim headlines. It belonged to a past that requires attention. Years earlier, before Jonah was known as Flash, a boy named Jonah had shown up at a small county hospital with an injured leg and a mother who smelled faintly of smoke and bill payments. The surgeon on call that night was not a TV star. He was a man named Kenji Saito whose hands had once been too quick in the ring and later became the steady hands of surgeon. He had stitched, trimmed, and set tendons. He had told parents that if they followed the regimen, the child would run again. Kenji had reasons to leave the operating room, reasons a simple photograph couldn't show. He had stepped away from surgical lights and into dojo lamps after a personal failure. A fighter he had trained had once died in a ring because of something Kenji thought he might have prevented. He had been young, furious at himself, and full of vows that never aged well. So, he left that life quietly and made a different kind of vow: to teach, to prevent, to watch. In the years after, through the small networks that stitched towns together, he had kept an eye on Jonah. Not with the intrusive hunger of a stalker, but like someone who had once been responsible and could still be useful. Now, in that sweaty room, Kenji said something soft enough that cameras would not catch its clarity, but clear enough for Jonah's manager to hear. "You have that scar because I fixed it." There was a pause long enough to be thick. The dojo sound was the slap of a cell phone on a bench and the distant hum of a refrigerator in the corner. Jonah's manager, who had negotiated fighters' contracts, had a small, human reaction: disbelief. Jonah's face, already contorted with pain, tightened into confusion. Memory does strange arithmetic. Jonah had been a child when the hospital visits happened. He had images, but not maps. The twist was not a melodramatic bloodline revelation. It was less tidy and, in many ways, more devastating. The old master did not reveal himself to be Jonah's father, a secret agent, or the head of a shadowy fight ring. He revealed that he had been the surgeon who had once repaired Jonah's knee and, importantly, that he had been watching, because responsibility does not always end at the moment someone clears the bill. Kenji's stillness was not a test of the boy's ego for the sake of humiliation. His stillness had been an active, considered choice. He had watched Jonah train with modern trainers and modern confidence, and had seen the tiny, invisible things that spell future failure. A foot placement here, a weight shift there, an old scar under the skin that hinted at structural weakness. He had understood, with the eyes of someone who had once fixed torn things, that to interpose himself would be to take away Jonah's choice. And sometimes the only way to force a person to choose better is to let them make the mistake first. This revelation arrived like cold water. The cameras recorded it, but the footage would later show faces, not meanings. In the moment, Jonah felt something tighten in his chest besides pain, something like the slow unwinding of a rumor. He had been thinking about audiences, about numbers and likes. He had not been thinking about the history of his own body or the debt he owed to surgeons he had never thanked. Kenji, who had once held scalpels, now held the moral ledger like a folded map. He said, quietly, that the boy had healed once under his hands. He said that when you repair someone, you hold their future in a strange, custodial way. He had watched Jonah grow and wanted, more than anything, to teach him to keep that future. The dojo felt suddenly small around a truth that was both generous and stinging. The old man had not been motionless because he was weak. He had been motionless because he had already moved when it mattered most. He had sewn a torn boy back together, then stepped aside years later to allow that boy to become a man who could either honor that repair or squander it. For Jonah, the twist was twofold. He discovered that his body had a history he had not fully acknowledged, and he discovered that the man he had come to humiliate had once been intimate with that history. It was humbling in the way that good medicine sometimes is a small, antiseptic moment revealing larger truths. After the initial medic scramble, after the manager called for an ambulance, and the people who had been filming started for once to film from memory rather than clicks, Jonah was taken to the hospital imaging. The diagnosis, partial ACL tear, meniscal bruising, was the sort of medical phrase that meant, in plain English, you might fight again but not the same way, and not if you ignore this. Surgery was an option. Rest, months of rehab, and the crushing medical humility of doing everything the rehab plan told him to do, or watching a career fray at the edges was another. Jonah, whose personality had been forged in highlight reels, had to sit in waiting rooms and learn what patience felt like. Patience, for a man used to fast edits and faster applause, was the cruelest thing. Kenji visited. He did not lecture Jonah about humility in the theatrical, viral bait manner Jonah's audience might have expected. He came with a small thermos of tea and a repaired reputation that the internet could not monetize. He sat in the corner of Jonah's hospital room and told him the story of the scar again, but now slowly, with unembellished facts. The night, the apartment with a broken heater, the mother who had cried and then worked 2 jobs. He did not dramatize. He simply said, "You were not invincible then. You are not invincible now." What mattered in the resolution was not the reveal, but the work that followed. Jonah began rehab, like someone who had been taught to do the easy part of something and never the slow part. He learned to strengthen the muscles around the injured joint, to take micro steps of progress, to talk about the pain the way someone speaks of a weather system. Not as a performance, but as a condition. The surprising part was how the crowd's interest shifted. Initially, people had shown up for the spectacle. As Jonah's recovery dragged itself through months, the narrative shifted from kid gets humbled to kid learns. His followers, the algorithm, and the people who had initially laughed now watched a different kind of real, mundane repetition, physical therapy sessions posted with captions about the truth of persistence. The story shifted from a viral flame to a slow flame. Kenji became an unlikely mentor. He did not teach flashy moves, he taught reading. He taught Jonah the meaning of movement that conserved rather than wasted. He taught him to notice the small cues that presage injury. A subtle misalignment in the ankle, a hesitation in a weight shift, the way a fighter's jaw tightens as he compensates for a weakness. He took the skills he'd used the patient focus, the precise measurement of risk, and transposed them for a living, breathing pupil who needed more than technique. He needed humility reinforced with skill. The true resolution was not that Jonah returned to the cage immediately and won a belt. It was quieter. He returned to training months later with different rhythms. Longer warm-ups, measured high kicks executed with a wary respect for their late costs, and attentiveness to body signals that had previously been background noise. On social media, he posted a video, not flashy, where he simply spoke about the injury, about the man who had fixed his knee years before, and about the hard math of what it costs to be human and to want more. The comments did what social comments do. Some cruel, some kind, many banal. But among them were messages from young fighters who said they had stopped pushing through pain after seeing Jonah's restraint. There was justice, but it was not punitive. The old master had not stood still to punish a child for brashness. He had stood still to allow the child to become someone who could handle an honest life. Sometimes justice is not about retribution. It's about setting conditions under which better choices become possible. Jonah learned to be a better version of himself. Not because the world demanded it, but because he had encountered someone who had once held his brokenness and not abandoned him. The moral arc bent toward generosity, hard-won and steady. Months after Jonah's rehabilitation began, after he had learned the slow art of repair and the small meditation of taking steps instead of leaps, he returned to the dojo where it had all started. This time, there were no cameras commissioned by managers, no promises of viral content. He came with a simple bag, an apology in his silence, and a curiosity for what stillness felt like when it was chosen rather than imposed. Kenji greeted him with the same quiet nod. They moved through drills that were unfamiliar to Jonah. Balance work, slow striking that emphasized precision over power, the kind of drills that make you feel absurdly old in the middle of your own life. Jonah approached them like a penitent student and slowly discovered a different kind of applause, one that comes when you land a move out of respect rather than dominance. One evening, after a long session, Kenji walked Jonah to the door. The dojo was empty except for the lingering smell of liniment and the low hum of the lights. Kenji put a small envelope into Jonah's hand. It was thin, the kind of envelope that suggests a note rather than money. Inside was a single page. No dramatic proclamation, just a short sentence in Kenji's handwriting that Jonah read aloud, though the room was empty enough that no one else heard it. The sentence said, simply, "I fix your knee once. I do not want to be the man who fixes your life the same way twice." Jonah looked up. He expected a lecture. Instead, Kenji smirked, an old, private smile that suggested someone who had been young and foolish once and survived it. Then the old man added, with deadpan timing that would have been perfect for a late-night host, "And also, if you break that knee again, you're buying the iced tea in the waiting room. These days, I don't operate for free." It was such a small, human joke, a contracted, worldly line that dissolved any residual grandeur into something the audience could reach for. The dojo, which had been a theater for moral severity, became, for a moment, a living room. The humor was the point. Life was not a series of grand proclamations. It was a messy ledger of help, small kindnesses, and the occasional bad joke to relieve the pressure. The crowd online later took that line and clipped it into a dozen memes. People made it into a catchphrase. "Buy the iced tea, kid." It had the perfect simplicity for an age that liked its wisdom as much as its coffee, condensed and shareable. But the real shock of the ending was not the joke. It was the idea behind it. The man who had the power to fix had chosen, over the years, to help people heal themselves, and to do so with the kind of gentle sting that makes a person better. He had not moved when provoked because he had already moved when it mattered the most. Years ago, in a hospital room where a scared boy had needed hands that could steady him, Kenji turned to Jonah one last time and said, not for cameras, not for likes, but to the man who had once been a child under his hands, "Don't make me fish you out of the river twice. I know how to do it, but I'd rather you learn how to climb out yourself." If that isn't a story about fathers, teachers, mistakes, and small mercies disguised as old men's jokes, then nothing in the world is. What would you have done if you were in Jonah's shoes? Kept showing off to keep the fame, or stopped to listen to the quiet person who might know you better than you know yourself? If this story landed with you, if it made you wince, laugh, or rethink a small thing you do for attention, please hit like, leave a comment with your take, and subscribe for more real, surprising stories from Tales of Wonder. Share this with someone who thinks stillness is weakness. They might be due for a little lesson. See you in the next video.